I bring you all greetings from Emmanuel College in Toronto and our ecumenical consortium, the Toronto School of Theology. Emmanuel College is innovating in multi-religious theological education, and so I would invite you to consider our master's and doctoral level programs as a next step, maybe after Villanova. I want to thank Julie Sheets and Suzanne Wenzel for their hospitality in organizing my visit, Stephanie Knaus for coordinating today's lunch with graduate students, and also to my colleague, Dr. Carrie Sanchirico, who extended the invitation to give this lecture. And you all should know that as the current president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies, he's a leading voice in interreligious engagement. I've benefited, Carrie, from your skill in organizing our activities together, as well as from your scholarship, which continues to open up new insights in our field. So everybody take a class from him. And it's also a real pleasure to join this series of conversations that are framed by the legacy of Nostra Aetate. I'll leave it to the Catholic theologians and church historians to delve into that document itself at the conference in November. But what I'm going to share today is an outgrowth of the legacy of Nostra Aetate. It's a work of comparative theology, which is a field that explores the dialogue of theological exchange, which is one of the ways that we have dialogue with a people of other faith traditions. Comparative theology explores the gifts of doing Christian theology in conversation with others. In brief, it's the practice of learning deeply from another tradition, often by choosing particular texts, thinkers, rituals, or historical moments. Really getting particular, really looking deeply in order to reflect anew on one's own tradition. Learning how Hindus organize meaning gives me different angles into issues in Christian theology. So I'll share, this is the provocative cover, I'll share a particular example of this from my recent book on theological anthropology, which I've called Body Parts, where learning from one theological sub-tradition of India's wisdom traditions has helped me to grapple with the metaphor of humanity created in the image of God. So theological anthropology, you see two words there, theology, which is the discipline of faith, seeking understanding, and then anthropology, so within that broad discipline, pursuing the question of what it means to be human in the image of God or in relation to God. We first hear in the creation narrative in Genesis that humans are created in God's image, imago Dei. But what is that image? There have been a lot of answers to this question of what about us images God, but the problem is that it seems to me whenever Christian theologians have tried to define it, tried to nail it down, it excludes someone. Unsurprisingly, the image of God usually looks a lot like the people making the doctrine. And so, as with this person who's created in God's image, who's basically a younger version of the older, bearded white man reigning on high. And so, for example, if the normative human being is the ruling male, then the implication is that subordinate men or women are not created in God's image or are deficient in some way. And some of our most revered theologians here at Villanova University have said as much. So you kind of digest that. I once made the mistake of telling someone at a party what I was writing. And the rest of the evening was taken up with him explaining to me and insisting that statements like this from Augustine are just distortions. The doctrine itself of humanity created in God's image is fine. So if you just kind of strip off the sexism, the image of God is something that belongs equally to everyone. And I should have just said okay and enjoyed my glass of Chardonnay, but I wanted to have that conversation because I think there's something going on here, something deeper. We need to think about what that image is supposed to be. And so, what about us exactly mirrors the divine? And what do our answers to this question tell us about what kind of people we value? So I'm not interested in relitigating questions about God's gender. For the last 50 years, feminist theologians have been doing a very nice job with that. I want to ask the fundamental question of what part of human being resembles our Creator. There have been three major models. A substance model, which says that there's some substance within us that is what images God, usually the rational soul. A functional model that says that there's something that we do that is the image of God. And the relational model, which says that because we are created in relationship with one another, that is how we image God. So we'll just look at these. First, the substance model. Here, it's typically been something called the rational soul, sometimes the will, that is the thing in human beings that is in God's image. So whatever it is, there's something about reason that figures prominently, the ability to think about things and make decisions. And so moving into the Enlightenment, you see here this cosmic man who's very well proportioned, and there's number and proportion and logic built into the structure, and to the extent to which we look like that or can understand that, then we might be also in sync with God. Now, in the Enlightenment, that reason really comes to the fore, but even before that, so we see here in Aquinas that it's the intellectual nature that's the image of God. And here, if women are construed as being lesser in the intellectual nature, then they're not equal bearers of the divine image. And then think about the other implications of this. So if it's intellectual nature we're looking for, there are some class implications too. So what about those who don't have access to education? Or how about age? Those who are so young that they don't, their intellect is still forming, or those perhaps who are in the later years of their life, where those powers are also not as strong as perhaps they once were. Are they in the image of God? And historically, racialized persons have been implicated in this doctrine as well, as we see here from Sean Copeland. Africans being identified with opaque bodies which couldn't have been made in the image of God, according to theologians. And also, if, again, we're looking at a particular construction of intellectual nature, persons with disabilities, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, might not quite measure up. And I should add that each of these dimensions shapes the others. They're mutually constitutive and intersectional, so that the patriarchal and androcentric assumptions about what makes someone fully human interweave with colonial, racist, classist, ableist, and transphobic assumptions as well. So substance anthropology, as you can imagine, most of the people working on this doctrine today aren't too keen on it, so they look to other alternatives. How about a functional anthropology? The image is something that we do. So here in Genesis, this is right after the passage that says, let's make humankind in our image, and it goes to something that human beings do, have dominion over the creatures. So perhaps it's stewardship of creation, or mastery over creation, maybe even creativity itself. In the capitalist version of this doctrine, it's productivity that matters, that shows that we are exercising this function. Another variation on a functional anthropology, did any of you ever see those bracelets that say WWJD, what would Jesus do? When I was a kid, we had these at youth group. But the idea that you do what Jesus does, and maybe that's what makes you in the image of God. So what would that be? Here from womanist theologian Dolores Williams, you see Jesus as someone who acts in liberating ways. He heals, he sets people free, he touches people. So perhaps these are the kinds of things that make us in the image of God if we look at Jesus and do what he did. And I think there are some real strengths to this model. But again, what about people who are unable to do any of these things, whether because of young or old age, disability, or otherwise? Are they excluded? And so some theologians of disability go to relational anthropologies. Here we see the famous Rublev icon of the Trinity, where the three are deferring to one another. They're in a relationship with one another. Maybe they're eating together, right? Everyone, like the Trinity, is in relationship to God and one another. And so perhaps this is how we image God. So is it better then if the image of God is not some measure of our rational capacity, but rather something that we do, or our ability to relate? Theologian Molly Haslam raises this question in relation to a test case of profound intellectual disability. She introduces Chan. Chan is a composite figure that she sketches from her experience before her doctoral work as a physical therapist. Chan was born with cerebral palsy. His IQ is below 25. He's developmentally similar to an infant who hasn't learned to roll, to hold its head upright, or sit unsupported. She writes, in terms of his level of communication, Chan's behavior does not indicate the ability to comprehend words or sentences, neither is he able to produce them. He does not demonstrate an ability to use gestures or sounds with the intent to communicate his needs or wants. And so, Chan's caregiver, Philip, feeds, bathes, and moves Chan from his bed to his chair. He brings him each day to a day treatment center for persons with intellectual disabilities. And she notes that Chan responds to his environment. So Philip notices that Chan exhibits awake behavior when Philip arrives in the morning, but when other caretakers are present, he exhibits sleep behavior. At physical therapy, when the therapist aligns Chan's bodies left or right of center, the movement of his neck and his legs indicates that he's trying to right his posture. And when others at the center play with a bright yellow balloon, his vocalization and motor activity increase. So Philip moves his chair to be near the game. Chan's behavior can be described as responsive, but not intentional. He responds to the presence of certain objects and people, and he exhibits awareness of the position of his body. However, he does not show the intent to communicate, for example, by moving his eyes between a person and a desired object. He doesn't exhibit intent to accomplish goals, for example, by trying a new behavior when another doesn't work. And this is significant for Haslam in relation to influential theologians like Gordon Kaufman or George Lindbeck, whose view of the human is tied up with self-reflection, intentionality, and language use. Chan does not possess the capacity to employ concepts of self and other required for intentional agency, nor an ability to express himself symbolically using public gestures, words, or actions with the intent to give meaning to experience, she writes. So Haslam is pushing theological anthropology into new territory. Although intellectual disability has recently become the subject of a number of new theological works, it still remains under-theorized. Theologians of disability tend to reject a substance anthropology in favor of a relational notion of the human. But despite the intent to the contrary, Haslam observes, a relational emphasis still betrays a bias toward a level of intellectual ability that's unavailable to individuals with profound intellectual disabilities. The turn to the relational self implies that participation in the imago Dei requires the intellectual capacity to conceive of the self as distinct from the world around us. In other words, it requires that the person be self-conscious. And so this is where I introduce comparative theology. Comparative theology, as I said, is a method of studying a religious tradition other than one's own. And I know some of you are in a course right now where you've been studying theologies of religious pluralism. So models like exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, that sort of try to discern whether multiple religions have truth in them, whether there's salvation there. Well, comparative theology kind of brackets those questions and goes ahead and studies another religious tradition without deciding in advance what will be found. And so when you study a tradition other than one's own, at least as a comparative theologian, you then end up returning to your own tradition with some new questions, maybe some new categories you'd like to try on. And so I'm going to give you an example of that from my own work. The tradition that I've been studying is the non-dual Shaivism of Kashmir. And so this is a tradition, Shaivism, that names ultimate reality as Shiva. And you've probably seen this image of the dancing Shiva before, so that's who we're talking about. This is a dance of creation and destruction, the cycle of life, and it's all his dance. He's also dancing and trotting on the demon of ignorance, right? So there's enlightenment there. This is a tradition that one of its main proponents is Abhinavagupta from the 11th, 12th century. The texts that I've been looking at for this project are a subset of he's quite a prolific and amazing philosopher and theologian, 2 commentaries on a tantric text called The Goddess of the Three. Both of them are attributed to him. One of them is probably from later in the tradition. There are a couple of things about this tradition that immediately stand out to me as possibly helpful or at least intriguing. One is that you see here in the right side, there's something interesting happening here with gender, right? Shiva is sometimes half a man, half a woman. He together with his consort Shakti means power. It's conceived of as feminine. It's non-dual because they're not really able to be separated, yet they're not able to be conflated either. So it's not a monism, but somehow not two, somehow not one. And there's a lot of interesting room in between there to explore philosophically. Now, the most important thing for this theological project is that Abhinavagupta's tradition also has an analogy that humanity mirrors the divine. So the divine body of consciousness that has the same structure as the cosmic body and also the body of each conscious individual. And it's a mirror analogy, and so that makes me think how interesting. We have this image of God thing happening in both traditions. I wonder what we can learn about that. And one of the most interesting parts of the non-dual Shaiva version of this is that image is multiple. Get ready. there are at least 36 parts. So these are the tattvas, the principles, the categories. Because this whole schema is thought of as the body of consciousness, I'm going to go ahead and call them body parts. It's embodied. It's always becoming material. So let me kind of explain what's happening here. Theologians in this, oops, I was supposed to not touch anything. Okay. Theologians in this Shaiva tradition imagine divinity in a process of unfolding into multiplicity and then refolding into unity. So you remember, Shiva's doing that dance of creation, destruction. So it's an unfolding into creation and then a folding back into unity again and again. Creation emerges with a glimmer of awareness. So I've got an eye there. You can imagine an eye opening and you're a little blurry at first and then things become more clear. So creation emerges with a glimmer of awareness that first expands into 5 increasingly differentiated degrees of subject and object. So those first 5 there have to do with the relationship between the self and the other. And so far in these first 5, they're not totally distinct. That's that play between Shiva and Shakti, where it's pure consciousness, maybe just the intent to create, but nothing is there yet. And then various versions of I am, this, right? Just barely your eyes are opening, you're not really sure you're even awake, right? You're not even sure there's anything but you yet. Gradually emerging. Human beings experience this part of divine reality in the phases of deep sleep, in a coma, or in the kind of profound intellectual disability experienced by Chan. Now, in the next section, where we're going to focus today, there are 6 limitations to divine consciousness. And so we'll be returning to that second called the limited body. After that, the subjective body, which includes the mental apparatus. Very interesting to me that if in the Christian tradition, the intellect or the mind is the most important thing about us, it's just right in the middle of this. It's like not all that special. It's kind of located in the middle of many, many other things about us. And then after, now we're becoming sort of more and more concrete, the organs of sensation and action, and the subtle and gross elements. Somehow this version of the picture cut off the 36, which is Earth, right? But anyway, there's 36. Everything in creation is here as part of the divine body, and this is mirrored in every conscious being and the cosmos as a whole. So I think that these categories can really stimulate the Christian theological imagination. So I already mentioned Chan. So he's not exactly in relation. He doesn't have a clear sense of self and other. And that kind of experience is there in that first set of body parts. There's also multiplicity built in here. There's room for diversity. Gender is here. Both, Shiva and Shakti are right there at the beginning. That's actually items 1 and 2. But then in the organs of sense and action, number 26, that's procreating. So that involves generative organs, inherent difference. And then, so the chapters of my book go through these different sections, all as part of the body of the divine. And I think that all of this is enormously helpful in helping Christians to think about the sacred worth of embodiment and also the natural environment, the whole range of the dimensions of our being. And so let's focus today on how the part of the model that is perhaps the most controversial might be key to opening up the image of God so that no one is left out. This part that I've called the limited body. So Abhinavagupta affirms that limits are a part of divinity's reflection in humanity. He also acknowledges how counterintuitive the idea of divine limitation can be, especially in light of other systems of Indian philosophy that deny that these 6 sheets of the limited body belong to ultimate reality at all. Some systems of Indian theology cut that off and put that outside of the divine reality. But not Abhinavagupta. He explains that the parts of the limited body are known as dharanas because they come from the word to think. They make the empirical individual think of the universal powers of Shiva differently. They're different perspectives. And from the divine perspective, the sheets are Shiva's own powers, his shaktis, his powers of limitation. Without them, Shiva would simply be pure consciousness without an object. Limitation enables divinity to experience things in a way that a self-contained being never could. Within the world, divine omnipotence is expressed as limited power. Omniscience appears as limited knowledge. Divine fullness opens up to desire. In contrast to ideals of divine omnipotence and infinity, bodies, including divine bodies, are limited in time and space. Humans move within a world of diversity made possible by this series of divine self-limitations. So Abhinavagupta's categories will guide now a consideration of how a Christian theology of limitation might include the full range of human and divine embodiment. So I'll just say a little bit about each of these sheets or these parts of the limited body. In this cosmology, limited consciousness, or Maya, is the first sheet. And it unfolds into the other particular limitations in power, knowledge, satisfaction, time, and space. Each one is a tattva, a body part in its own right. And so let's think about each of these. Now, of course, the root of all limitation, if this is the body of consciousness, it's Maya, the limitation of consciousness. And so, as I mentioned, Shiva's eyes open, and the world comes into being, they close, and the universe dissolves again into undifferentiated bliss. The universe is pervaded with divine consciousness. The limited body is necessary because, in order for sentient creatures to emerge as individual centers of consciousness, universal consciousness must be delimited. Maya is the initial limitation to divine consciousness and the precondition for creation. It makes it possible for the divine subject to recognize a distinct object, not just I am this, but I and this. Some Indian philosophies paint Maya negatively as illusion that veils the unity of reality. And that's actually how human beings experience it. Maya functions in daily life to bar human beings from experiencing the omniscience, omnipotence, and freedom that characterize pure consciousness. But for the non-dual Shaiva tradition, the veils that adhere to consciousness are not evil. They're not bad. Maya is better construed as artifice, the principle of creation, and as one of Shiva and Shakti's powers. The blessing of limited consciousness is that there are some things rather than no things. Limitation also makes devotion to a deity possible, right? There needs to be a me, an I, and a thou for that. If humans are to love, worship, imitate, and adore God, then God must self-limit as a discrete other who could be the object of these actions. And if there's to be history, there must be actors distinct from God. So how about power? Abhinavagupta observes that Shiva in the condition of deep sleep is incapable of anything. The body part of limited power restores a limited capacity for action. Because of limitation, divinity is able to do things it otherwise could not do. And so on the human side, although we might fantasize about defying the laws of nature with super strength or stamina, the divine image does not make us omnipotent. Knowledge, jnana, this divine power restores to limitless consciousness the capacity for limited knowledge. Because of it, divinity and others can know particular things. Knowledge is limited, as an inevitable consequence of having particular bodies, having certain experiences and not others, being situated in particular place and time, and so on. Pure objectivity eludes the inquiries of embodied beings, and divinity is capable of such experiences as well. Limited satisfaction, that's another word for desire. The Sanskrit word for this body part is raga, desire or attachment. And of course, desire and attachment can be a negative spiritual impact for individual beings, but also for divinity as well as human beings. It's the motivation for action and also for love. The Sanskrit word for limitation in place is niyati. It means necessity, fate, destiny. The divine powers to experience time and localization mean that divine consciousness can be found in every moment and in every place. The function of niyati tattva, one teacher in this tradition explains, is to give people the impression of residing in such and such a place, and not in all places. We could also add that spatial limitation is therefore related to the contingency that we call culture. When people are born and where they dwell determine much about them, including their language, and it's the starting point for their assumptions and their identity. So, what can Christians learn about theological anthropology by studying non-dual Shaivism? We observe that when Christian theological anthropology has defined the image of God in terms of a single feature, it excludes many people. Those that don't exercise reason at a level and standard theologians determine, substance anthropology. Those that cannot do the thing that's taken to be the image of God, as in a functional anthropology. And those that can't engage as a partner in a relationship, as in the relational anthropology. So the non-dual Shaiva model encourages us to have multiple facets of the image, kind of like a jewel. The beauty and complexity of humanity reflects the divine. And so we might notice that there are, the three major models are here in this very complex model. That substance anthropology with the subjective feature is, as we noted, kind of right in the middle. There are functional dimensions in terms of the organs of sense and action, and the organs of sense and action also put us in relationship with one another. And the 36 parts also exceed those three models and prompt me as a Christian to consider whether and how both embodiment and limitation might be part of the divine image. So this 36-part scheme is a little startling for Christians, I think, in terms of its frank placement of limitations squarely within its model of God and the world and humanity. If these are part of the image of God, then what does that say about God? To Christians, attributing limitations to God seems counterintuitive, even impious. In the categories of classical theism, God is perfect, omnipotent, omniscient, and above the fray. If humans are limited, it must be because we're not God. It's this kind of surprise factor that's one of comparative theology's benefits as a method. The unexpected inclusion of limits within divinity invites us to investigate, to know more, to try on the idea that limits are not an afterthought or a deficit in defining perfection, but inherent in the divine relation to creation. So let me just pull a couple of threads to see if this is something that we can consider. Perhaps limits don't blur the image of God, but reveal its depths. So, if we observe that the God of classical theism is limited by the inability to engage in real relation with the world, what does that do? Right? that God is sort of unaffected, has no emotions. That's the classical attribute of apatheia, not really related in the way we relate. Well, doesn't that limit God? To deny God that ability to relate? Attempts to protect God from the vulnerability of relation and change place limits on God's ability to love. A reading of Scripture through the lens of relationship yields a different view. We discern a compassionate God who freely enters into relationship with the world, creating new life, responding to injustices with righteous anger, and lamenting tragedy and degradation. The fact that God can suffer these things is not a deficiency, but rather a perfection. God's compassionate presence offers comfort, solidarity, and empowerment, which mysteriously transforms suffering. And so if God's loving relation to the world is real, then each of the divine attributes can be reimagined, reinterpreted. A number of contemporary theologians who have taken issue with classical theism turn instead to a model in which God is both transcendent of the world and immanent within it. It's not classical theism, but panentheism. It's not pantheism where God is reduced to the world, but rather a model in which the all, pan, is within God. Panentheism. God retains God's transcendence in a manner similar to the way that the self both includes but is not reduced to the physical body. Sally McFagg is one theologian who has explored the model of the world as God's body. This understands God to be intimately related to and affected by what happens in the world without being reduced to it. Now, people hesitate naturally to describe defects to the God they worship. But the association of limitation with defects, implies that the more limits we have, the less we are like God. And this implication has been particularly damaging for people with disabilities. Christian theologian Deborah Creamer therefore picks up Sally McFagg's model of the world as God's body to point out that if God includes all of creation within God's existence, then God includes limits. God is no less complete for including death, decay, and finite resources. This claim flies in the face of an ideal of divine perfection that would construe limits as defects. A view of divine perfection that includes limits challenges this ideal. So, what could we retrieve from Christian teaching to revisit the possibility that limits are part of God's experience? In terms of the first limitation, limited consciousness, the doctrine of the Trinity opens some very interesting possibilities. How can the three persons know each other? In Shaiva terms, divine consciousness remains unified while nevertheless contracting into subject and object. Both I am this and I and this. Trinitarian difference is the basis of the imago Dei in human relation and sociality, many theologians have asserted. And so perhaps some of this ways that God is both one and three can be opened up here. But do limitations in power, knowledge, satiation, time, and space also belong to God's body? Power. Christian theologians throughout the ages have considered whether and how divine power might be limited. Whether through the sovereign decision to allow creatures to have free will, right? That's a limitation on divine power. Or more recent process theologies and various versions of panentheism, in which the choices of creatures are both part of God's unfolding experience and set the tone and set the conditions within which divinity responds. As for desire, human networks of care and creativity reflect the divine desire for creatures flourishing. The satiation of desire is limited even for God. We can see this in Scripture. Hebrew and Christian Scripture reveal a God passionately committed to a relationship with the world and with particular people who often disappoint, a God who takes on suffering of the world. For human beings in God's image, love exposes each of us to lack and conflict and tragedy, even as it weaves a fragile beauty out of complex relations. In terms of the limitations of time and space, perhaps the very structure of human knowing requires a circumscribed message and messenger suited to the epistemic situation. This is an insight that's encapsulated in the paradoxical Christian claim that a universal truth has been communicated through a particular divine incarnation. The incarnation blesses the limited lifespan and the particularity and vulnerability of a life lived in place, the power and persuasiveness of the encounter with divinity on a local and personal level. When Christian theological anthropology thinks that the image must be something disembodied, it devalues bodies, especially female, black and brown, and disabled bodies, implying that these people do not image God to the same extent as others. So what is our context? In a time in the United States when who counts and who matters is being narrowed, I think it's worth revisiting this doctrine. When America first means closing the borders unless people can produce and contribute, and closing the borders to people who don't look like a white Christian norm. When black bodies that earlier counted as only 3/5 of a human are criminalized and removed from the population through the prison industrial complex. And brown bodies can be deported in neighborhood raids, children kept in cages at borders. Or female labor is literally worth less, 78 cents on the male dollar. And non-normative bodies and intellects in the school system and transgender bodies in public places are excluded by law or policy. We have to think within the context about our doctrines. Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr based his doctrine of sin around the fact that human beings grasp at power and knowledge that they were never meant to have. There is grace in living within the limitations of our particular embodiment, our particular time and place, and avoiding the hubris of thinking that our point of view is universal, especially when people with privilege assume that it's obvious what is perspective, assume what seems obvious from the perspective of their whiteness or the relative comfort of the middle class is also true for everyone else in the political or economic system. The pretension of universality is a sin, Niebuhr taught, because every perspective is qualified by its here and now relation to a particular body. Our abilities and understanding remain conditioned by our own location in the world. And so, I'd invite us to consider that a theological anthropology informed by non-dual Shaivism finds some new ways to emphasize not only that bodies matter, but that every body and every perspective is limited. And this too could be taken as a matter of wonder and care. That God's image includes such diversity sets us up for our task of life together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to get it. We're going to do it right. Thank you very much, Dr. Voss Roberts. We're going to do something a little different today. We're going to mix it up a little. This is something that Michelle, if I may, talked to me about before she decided to come. Felt like there was a stipulation. I said, okay, whatever it takes, we're going to do this a little differently. So here's the thing. I want you to turn to the person next to you and give them a hug. Just kidding. You don't have to give them. See, now it's easy. I would like you to turn to a person next to you, and I would like you to talk to them for 5 minutes about questions that you might have that were raised by Dr. Voss Roberts' address. Having discussed for 5 minutes, maybe you want to formulate a question. Formulate the question, think about who will ask the question, and then we'll go from there. How about that? The other little stipulation is, it's not just an editorial commentary. Make sure it's a question. Can we do that? And begin. Okay, friends. Do we have questions? Okay, we're done. No.
Hi. Is this on? You can. Okay. I thought that the comparative theology was really, really interesting, and I wanted to ask, because you seem to be kind of digging at truth that's revealed in different religions and comparative theologies, but do you think that, and I don't want to pronounce this wrong, that non-dual Shaivism, thank you, is a better representation of the divine than Christianity is, or that it just offers a new lens within which to look?
Yeah, good question. I think about it more in terms of a new lens. So I'm very interested in this path. I have enjoyed studying the philosophy and have kind of absorbed some of it, right? Like, wow, that actually kind of makes sense. And as you can see from the presentation today, helps me answer some questions about my own tradition, maybe in somewhat, just it started helping me to make sense of some things. I would say it's helpful. I mean, I don't need to necessarily say that it's better or worse. In fact, part of the comparative process is, exploring within this non-dual Shaiva tradition sends me back to my own tradition. So there at the end, when I was talking about openings within the Christian tradition, the book goes into it much more deeply. For each of the sets of body parts, there's a particular place in the Christian tradition where I then go deep to explore. So like with the variations and gradations of consciousness, Meister Eckhart's reflections on the Trinity are about as close to that as you can get, but it's within the Christian tradition, right? And so at each point, I wonder, have Christians ever had ideas like this, or have we ever tried to answer it using an angle like this? And so then it sends me back to different places. I've learned things about Christianity that I never would have learned had I not gone to Hinduism first. It's that kind of back and forth movement that is so generative about comparative theology. Francis Clooney, who's at Harvard, is one person who's widely credited with the sort of rebirth or the formation of this version of comparative theology in the academy. And he really says, look, we want to bracket those questions about, like, is Hinduism truer than Christianity, or is there salvation over here or there, right? And instead, just keep asking those interesting questions, right? You almost never have to land on the answer to that question, because honestly, only God knows, right? And we can experience the grace of being located in a particular tradition, as well as the grace of what opens up when we have conversation with our neighbors.
Other questions? Don't be scared. Right now, one of you is saying, I should ask this question. Do it. It would be even better if it was one of my students.
No pressure.
No pressure. No other questions, really? Yes, sir. Some of you know who Phil Donahue is. Yes.
So through comparative theology, you said people come back to their own religion with more questions, and sometimes they're hesitant to apply defects to their own deity. So as a theologian, is it better to be religious and have a sort of biased point of view, or to be unbiased and not a very religious point of view?
We talked about this a bunch over lunch, actually. And your question goes really to the heart of some major methodological questions in the study of religion. Where, it used to be that, maybe sometimes you'll still see this, that there's a big divide between religious studies where people don't take a position of faith. They're sort of objective, disinterested, and so forth, and they're describing and they're investigating, right, without putting value on it. And then there's theology, which is guided by revelation and starts from a position of faith or preconceptions about what's true, and you know, both sides have been kind of suspicious of each other. But now we're in a moment where on this side with religious studies, we're recognizing, you know, postmodern sensibilities that everybody comes from somewhere and everybody has presuppositions. And so religious studies scholars are working to make those presuppositions more visible, to actually find and articulate them so that they can better understand how their standpoint may influence what they are observing. Right? It's a good scholarly practice to do, to locate yourself and think about, well, why do I care about this in the first place, and how did I come to this, and what does my position maybe condition me to notice that maybe somebody from a different background would notice, right? On the theology side, theologians want to be good scholars and shouldn't be afraid of the findings of people on the side of religious studies. And so that's why comparative theologians are like, let's just learn. Let's learn deeply from a tradition that we find fascinating. Let's have interesting conversations. Let's use all the best scholarly methods. Let's learn the languages. Let's do ethnography, right? And then we can ask theological questions about it, informed by good scholarship. And so the divide between those two things, is it better to do one or the other? I think we are always located, and so we can't sort of not do that. And if we are located, it's better to name it. And of course, faith-seeking understanding, that's never a single or solid thing either. There are all kinds of ways that we come in and out of doubt and faith and degrees of belief and questioning. And that's kind of part of it as well, that there's meaning that's being made.
Other questions? Sir.
So I may have missed the answer to this earlier, but you had mentioned how some with physical disabilities feel left out within the image of God. Using the comparative theology then, how are those with disabilities viewed in the non-dual Shaivistic tradition?
So this is a place where my constructive imagination has taken over, right? I start from questions from disability studies, ask questions about the doctrine of the image of God, find kind of more capacious ways of looking at it. But that doesn't mean that people from this particular tradition are explicit about a disability theology, right? That's my constructive work as a Christian theologian after encountering this image of God that includes limits, right? And so, of course, in that tradition, everything is the body of consciousness, right? And part of the discipline of the tradition is to recognize that. Even if you can't recognize it, it's true, right? And so that non-dual nature is true of all people. Now, I've done more work in the Christian tradition where I've actually found the texts that sort of undercut the affirmation of the image of God in people by talking about lesser intellects and things and inferior bodies and things like that. Does that exist in other traditions? Yeah. I haven't found it, but we can see that there are ways that this is the veil of Maya, right? Ways that our limited perspective influences how we see other people and how we treat other people, and it's the work of spiritual growth to come to a better understanding of how other people belong to God's image.
Other questions? Okay.
So this, I'm interested in kind of the relationship or your understanding of the relationship between comparative theology and sort of the kinds of interfaith encounters that people have in communities and on college campuses that often are focused on learning about practices rather than theologies. And I guess it's a question about, maybe you can speak from your own experience, how does your study of another theology kind of inform your own practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it comes to me at a time when I'm inventing a new syllabus for so at Emmanuel College we have Buddhist and Muslim and Christian and programs, but then also students from those traditions and Hindus and Jews and the spiritual but not religious, right? And so we're trying to think about how do we initiate everybody into this community where we're going to be engaging with one another, learning about one another, figuring out how to talk to each other. This work of comparative theology, you think, well, like, am I going to learn Sanskrit or go to India and really, dig that deep? It turns out that this is a method anybody can do. So if you look at Francis Clooney's new book called Learning Interreligiously, it's a series of blog posts where he basically says, you can do this too, in the size of a blog post, right? And he even demonstrates that there are traditions that he doesn't know much about it at all, but he can use the same method. He could pick up the Book of Mormon and learn some things about it, and then have that back and forth movement with his tradition. So this is a method that can also be used in relationship to practices. So if you learn from another tradition, like, oh, interesting, you do that around the birth of a baby? Huh, why, right? And then you go, well, that's really interesting. I wonder why we do it our way. And then you go and find out more, right? And ask questions not only about practices, but then also there's usually practices often have some sort of theological content, and so there's room for a deeper understanding. So my encouragement when we do a lot of interfaith dialogue that's about just religious literacy, getting to know, oh, you celebrate those holidays, or this is how you do your life cycle rites or whatever, that's not the end of it. It's not just about information, it's about the beginning of a conversation, one that also implicates you, right? Because you're going to share something, and then you might have new questions, or you might really kind of go, I wonder, I've never seen that done in my tradition, but I love it. Have we ever done something like that before, right? And so the method works the same if you're talking about texts, if you're talking about practices, if you're talking about like really, really deep PhD level scholarship, or simply, I want to get to know my roommate, right?
Perhaps one last question?
You mentioned free will as a limitation on the Christian God's power. Since God gave humans free will in creation, are his limitations self-imposed, or if not, like, where do they originate?
You are a true theologian. Great question. There's embedded in this question a really important theological point, right? So if God chose to self-limit by turning over some of the agency to creatures, then God was really omnipotent to begin with, right? God could choose to do that or not to do that. And so some theologians will sort of stop with that, and God retains God's sovereignty, but then after God chooses to give up some of the power, God has to act in accordance with God's choice, right? So God is then limited. Now there are going to be other theologians like, I'd say like Sally McFay, and if you start learning about process philosophy, some of the relational theologies, maybe some of the open theisms, from the very beginning, God is relational and therefore doesn't have all the power, right? Now that might feel like a really, really big step that you might not be interested in taking. There's a lot at stake in having a God who can do everything if God wanted to. right? The world that a lot of people experience is one in which that kind of idea, a God who could do something about all the radical suffering in the world but doesn't, that's an unacceptable God, right? And so, of course, we don't understand God's ways, but if we're thinking about metaphysics and God's power and how how far can creatures go, there are many theologians who think, no, from the very beginning, this is a relational universe, and God never had that sort of monarchical rule by fiat kind of power in the first place. And is that really the kind of God that we see in Scripture? Right? So deep questions, really good questions. So I'd encourage you to follow some of those threads and see what makes sense to you. All right, I think that was...
Well, that's it, and we want to thank you very much for being with us.